I'll never forget the moment I realized exactly how badly I'd underestimated the damage that was about to unfold. I was sitting in my car outside a coffee shop on a rainy Tuesday morning, my phone buzzing with yet another email from a panicked CFO asking if I could help with a problem, when it hit me. The best career decision I'd ever made wasn't the day I got hired at Ashford & Associates. It was the day I got fired. That sounds crazy, I know. Who looks back on being fired as a good thing? Who says getting dismissed without cause, walked out of the building by HR, cut loose after 8 years of dedication? Who says that's a good thing? But by the time you finish this story, you'll understand exactly why. Getting fired didn't feel like a setback at the time. It felt like a wake-up call, a call that said, you've been comfortable for 8 years. You've been letting someone else dictate your worth. You've been building someone else's dream, and now you have to answer the question, what do you actually want to build? And that wake-up call led me to build something I never would have built if I'd stayed comfortable. Something bigger, better, more profitable, and more aligned with what I actually wanted to do with my career. The universe has a funny way of pushing you toward your destiny, even when it doesn't feel good at the time. Let me take you back to where this story really begins, because to understand why getting fired ended up being the best thing that ever happened to me, you need to understand what I actually had built over the previous 8 years. My name's James, and for most of my professional career, I worked as a senior account director at a mid-sized B2B consulting firm called Ashford & Associates. Now, if you don't know what that means, basically my job was to manage relationships with some of the biggest corporate clients we had, companies with multi-million-dollar contracts. I'm talking about the kind of relationships that could make or break a company's year. I was the person who made sure they were happy, that their projects stayed on track, that deadlines were met, and that when something went wrong, and in consulting, something always goes wrong eventually, I was there to fix it personally. When I started at Ashford & Associates back in 2015, the company was already well established. The founder, Robert Ashford, great guy, genuinely brilliant businessman, had built this firm from nothing into something really successful. By the time I arrived, we had about 80 employees, solid revenue, and a reputation in the consulting space that actually meant something. We weren't a fly-by-night operation. Clients sought us out. But here's the thing about older, successful companies. They always have that one thing they don't talk about at interviews: the sun. Marcus Ashford was in his early 30s when I joined the firm. He'd done a stint at one of those famous business schools, had some experience at another company, though nobody seemed to know much about what that experience actually was, and everyone just sort of knew. They all knew that he'd eventually take over the business from his dad. It wasn't spoken about directly, at least not in front of employees, but it was there, hanging in the air like everybody could sense it coming. It was inevitable. In those first few years, Marcus was mostly out of sight. He worked in the New York office while we were based mainly in Boston, and honestly, I barely knew what he actually did, but I also didn't really care, because I was too busy building something that actually mattered. I was focused on one thing: becoming the absolute best at what I did. Not the best compared to other account directors, the best, period. And I did. By my 4th year at Ashford & Associates, I'd personally brought in and was managing about 42% of the firm's total annual revenue. I know that number sounds almost unbelievable, but that's just a fact that everyone in that company knew. Everyone. The partners whispered about it. Other account directors knew it. The CEO knew it. That's not me bragging, that's just the reality of the situation. To put this in perspective, there were about 30 other account directors at the company. Combined, they managed about 58% of revenue. I was outperforming nearly the entire rest of the account management team by myself. I wasn't getting special treatment or territory advantages. I just worked smarter, harder, and with more genuine care than anyone else. I'd managed to turn what were once small, transactional relationships into deep, strategic partnerships. Companies like Kellerman Industries, Hartwell Manufacturing, Sterling Financial Group. These weren't just clients on a spreadsheet. These were relationships I'd spent years nurturing, built on genuine understanding of their business, consistent delivery, and trust that had been earned through hundreds of conversations and interactions. I knew how their businesses worked. I understood their challenges. I could anticipate what they'd need before they knew they needed it. I knew the CEOs of these companies. I knew their families. I knew that Kellerman's CEO had 3 kids, and he was stressed about paying for college. I knew that Sterling Financial's CEO had just gone through a divorce and was trying to rebuild his life. I'd sat in their offices when they were scared about quarterly earnings, when board members were pressuring them, when the market was moving against them. I wasn't just the vendor, I was the confidant. I was the person they called when they needed honest advice, not just a sales pitch. I'd celebrated with them when they closed major deals. When Kellerman had that massive reorganization in 2018, I was there helping them think through their operational consulting strategy. I wasn't just billing hours. I was invested in making sure the reorganization went smoothly. I stayed late. I answered calls at night. I cared about the outcome. When Sterling Financial needed someone to trust during an audit transition, which was a delicate, sensitive time when everything they did was under a microscope, they asked for me specifically, by name. They didn't ask for an account director. They didn't ask to switch their account to someone else on my team. They asked for James. They said, "We need someone we can trust, and that's you." That kind of loyalty doesn't happen by accident. That takes time. That takes genuine care. That takes showing up, again and again, not when it's easy, but especially when it's hard. That takes actually caring about their success more than you care about the billable hours. And I did. I cared more about their success than I cared about impressing my bosses at Ashford, and they could feel that. I made good money, not absurdly wealthy, but enough that I wasn't stressed about bills. I drove a decent car, had a nice apartment in the Back Bay neighborhood of Boston, took vacations when I wanted them, and honestly felt like I'd earned it. But the money was never really the point. What I loved was the work itself. I loved solving complex problems for these companies. I loved the intellectual challenge of figuring out what they really needed versus what they thought they needed. I loved building trust with people who had every reason to be skeptical. I loved being the person my clients knew they could count on, no matter what. My relationship with Robert, the founder, was solid too. He'd see me in the halls, and he'd always take a moment to actually talk. Not the quick, "How's it going?" that executives usually do, but real conversations. He knew about my clients. He knew about my wins. He also knew about the times I struggled, and I was honest with him about those moments. And you know what? I think he respected me for that, for being honest about the difficult moments instead of just pretending everything was perfect. Life was good, really good. I had built something. I'd carved out a position at this company that genuinely mattered. I was valuable. I was respected. I had job security, or at least that's what I told myself. Then in the spring of 2023, things started to shift. Robert made an announcement at the company's annual gathering that he was stepping back. Not retiring completely. He was going to take a chairperson role, still involved, still there in an advisory capacity. But Marcus was being promoted to CEO. Marcus was finally taking the helm. I remember sitting in that auditorium with about 200 other employees, and honestly, I felt this little flutter of unease. Not panic, just that sensation you get when you sense change coming. Like when you're driving and you feel the car shift, and you know something's about to change in how the road feels beneath you. Marcus gave a speech. I'll be honest, it was a competent speech. He talked about innovation, about taking the firm to the next level, about honoring his father's legacy while charting a new course. He seemed confident, seemed in control. He smiled at the right moments and hit the right emotional notes. But there was something underneath it that I picked up on, something I couldn't quite name. A kind of hunger? Not in a good way. More like desperation trying to disguise itself as ambition, like he had something to prove. And I think on some level, I sensed that desperation might be dangerous. I didn't think too much about it then. I figured, okay, Marcus is CEO now. Things might change a little, but I'd built relationships with the actual clients. They trusted me. My value was proven. What could really go wrong? I'd survived leadership transitions before. This wouldn't be different. I will never, ever underestimate my own naivety again. About 6 weeks after Marcus took over, I got a meeting request on my calendar. Not unusual. I had meetings all the time. But this one was from Marcus directly, and it said, "Come by my office. Need to discuss some things." I remember walking up to the executive floor on a Friday afternoon, and there was something in my gut that whispered a warning. That little voice that says, something isn't right. But I pushed it down. I had meetings with senior leaders all the time. What was there to worry about? I walked into his office. Marcus was sitting behind an expensive mahogany desk. I'm pretty sure that desk wasn't there when Robert was CEO, and he had this expression on his face that I'll never forget. It was like he'd already made up his mind about something, and now he was just going through a process he had to complete, like he was reading from a script. He didn't even let me sit down properly before he started talking. "James, we're heading in a new direction with the company. I've been reviewing the organizational structure, and I think we need to make some changes to how we're allocating resources across our account management division. As part of that restructuring, we're letting you go. We'll give you a month's severance, help with your COBRA, and we'll have HR send over the details." I just stood there. I think I actually needed a moment for the words to translate into actual meaning in my brain. He fired me, just like that. No build-up, no performance review, no real conversation about what I'd done wrong or what he wanted to change. Just, you're done, you're out. We're moving in a new direction, and you're not part of it. The whole thing took less than 5 minutes from the time I walked in the door to the time I understood that my 8-year career at this company was over. And the worst part wasn't the firing itself. It was the way he did it. Like I was a line item that didn't fit the new spreadsheet. Like I was an inconvenience to be removed. Not a person who'd contributed nearly half the company's revenue. Not someone he'd worked with for almost a decade. Just someone who needed to be gone. I managed to keep my voice even when I asked the question I needed to ask. Can I ask why? My book of business is growing. My client satisfaction scores are... He cut me off. Look, you've been fine. But we're bringing in some new management, and frankly, I think there's been too much focus on maintaining old relationships instead of growing new business. We need fresh energy, fresh perspective. I'm sure you'll land on your feet somewhere. Fresh energy, fresh perspective. Those were code words for something, and I knew exactly what they meant. You didn't hire me, you don't owe me loyalty, and I need to bring in people who report to me and won't question my decisions. I need people I can control. I walked out of that office in a daze. I went back to my desk, and HR actually came and walked me out of the building that same day, like I was a security risk. They gave me a box for my personal items. There weren't many. I'd always kept my workspace pretty minimal, and that was it. 8 years, 42% of the company's revenue, deep client relationships that had taken years to build, and I was out. Done. Finished. The drive home was strange. I remember sitting at a red light and just feeling this weird sense of clarity wash over me. I wasn't devastated. I was angry, yeah. I felt disrespected, absolutely. But underneath all that, there was something else. A weird sense of liberation. Like I'd been holding something incredibly carefully, walking on eggshells, trying to keep everything balanced. And suddenly I'd set it down. I could stop performing, stop proving myself, stop being careful. That night I had dinner with my brother. He's a lawyer, and when I told him what happened, his first question was, did they give a reason on the termination papers? They hadn't, which was interesting because it meant they were either scared of giving a reason that might hurt them in a potential legal dispute, or they just didn't care enough to be thorough. He told me, from a legal standpoint, that's actually good for you. It means they didn't document any cause for termination. If they'd given a reason, you might have a chance to dispute it or argue about it. But they didn't. So if they come after you for anything, they'll have a harder time proving wrongdoing. But more importantly, he said something that stuck with me. You know what this means, right? Every single one of your clients is going to be wondering who's going to manage their account now. They're going to be confused. They're going to be concerned about continuity. And they're going to be looking for someone they can trust. You need to think about what you actually want to do next, because the opportunity here is bigger than you think. You have leverage, whether you realize it or not. I'd never thought about it that way before. I'd been so focused on the shock and the anger that I hadn't considered the actual mechanics of what had just happened. My clients didn't have a relationship with Ashford and Associates. They had a relationship with me, and now that relationship was up in the air. And that's when the idea started forming. Not a revenge fantasy or anything dramatic like that, just a practical realization. My clients didn't actually work with Ashford and Associates. They worked with me. The relationships, the trust, the understanding of their business, the knowledge of how to navigate their politics and challenges, all of that was tied to me personally. They didn't have a relationship with the company. They had a relationship with me. This was the critical insight. For 8 years, I'd thought I was building something for Ashford and Associates, but I wasn't. I was building something for myself, my reputation, my relationships, my value. The company had simply been the vehicle. Now the vehicle had ejected me, and I had all those assets, those relationships, that reputation to take with me. So what if I just went to them? What if I approached them about building something new together, something where they could work directly with me instead of paying Ashford and Associates overhead? Now, I was careful here. I didn't reach out to them immediately, and I didn't do anything that would violate my non-compete clause. I'd signed that agreement, and I intended to honor it, even though Marcus hadn't honored his implied agreement to treat me fairly. I wanted to be the bigger person. I wanted to do this the right way. I genuinely sat with it for 2 weeks, thought about whether I wanted to start my own firm or join someone else's established practice. I talked to a few colleagues in the industry about their experiences, what it was like to start a firm, what they'd do differently if they could do it again. I thought about whether this was the right move, financially, professionally, and ethically. I didn't want to do anything that would come back to haunt me later. I made spreadsheets. I did the math. I looked at how much revenue I could potentially bring over, how much I could charge without undercutting myself, what my costs would be. Could I actually make this work? Or was I just dreaming? The numbers were actually pretty compelling. If I could bring over even half my clients, I'd be making more money than I was at Ashford, with lower overhead. And my clients had already indicated that they were willing to work with me directly. So the question wasn't, is this possible? The question was, am I willing to do it? And then I decided I was going to start my own thing. A boutique consulting firm focused on exactly the kind of strategic, relationship-driven work that I loved. I called it Brennan Consulting. Brennan is my mother's maiden name, and I liked that it felt like an honoring of that connection to my family while I was starting something new, something that was just mine. I got a small office space in Cambridge, set up the basic infrastructure, got my business licenses, filed the paperwork, and then, crucially, I waited out my non-compete period. I didn't violate it. I didn't call clients. I didn't reach out to them. But I did something else. I went to each of my biggest clients for coffee, one by one. The first call I made was to Michael Kellerman, the CEO of Kellerman Industries. We'd known each other for 6 years at this point. I didn't call him as someone offering him a new service. I just called him as someone wanting to stay in touch. Hey Michael, I'm no longer at Ashford. I was thinking of you and wanted to catch up. Do you have time for coffee? We grabbed coffee at this place in downtown Boston, and maybe 2 minutes into the conversation he asked, "So what's next for you?" He asked it like he already knew that something was next, like he could sense that my being out of Ashford wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something new. I told him the truth, that I'd been fired, that I was starting something new, that I understood if he wanted to keep working with Ashford and Associates because they were an established firm with resources and everything, but that I'd love to talk about how I could help Kellerman with some strategic initiatives they'd mentioned needing help with. I laid it all out there. No hidden agenda, just honest. His response was immediate and emphatic. Are you kidding? Honestly, James, we worked with Ashford because we worked with you. Without you there, I don't know why we'd stay. You're the guy we want to work with. What's your timeline to start taking clients? How can we transition? That was the response I needed to hear. Not just a maybe, but a yes, absolutely, let's do this. Similar conversations happened with Sterling Financial, with Hartwell Manufacturing, with about 15 other companies that I'd worked with over the years, and the response was remarkably consistent across all of them. They didn't want Ashford and Associates. They wanted me. They wanted to work with me directly, without the overhead of a big firm. Some of them said things like, "We've been wanting to work with you directly for years. This is actually perfect." Others said, "We'll give Ashford 2 more months to get their act together, but honestly, we're probably leaving too." What struck me was that nobody asked about the reasons I was fired. Nobody asked about my qualifications or experience. They already knew all that. Nobody asked for testimonials or references from other clients. They just wanted to know when I could start taking their business. That's when I knew for certain that I'd made the right decision. Within 3 months of starting Brennan Consulting, I had signed contracts with 8 of my former clients. These were the biggest accounts, the ones that represented the most value. Kellerman Industries alone was worth about $400,000 a year in consulting fees. That's just one client. Within 6 months, I had 12. I was picking up new clients beyond my former Ashford relationships too. People would refer their friends to me. Companies would reach out because they heard about me from someone I'd worked with. My reputation was spreading. And here's the thing that really matters. They weren't paying me less. In fact, some of them were paying me more because I was more efficient now. They weren't paying for my time to spend 8% of it in internal meetings at a big firm. I wasn't dealing with the bureaucracy of a larger firm. I was more responsive. I was more invested in their actual success and growth. When they called with a problem, I picked up the phone. I didn't have to fight with partners or other departments to get things done. I just did it. By the end of the first year, Brennan Consulting was doing over $2 million in annual revenue. With just me and 2 consultants I'd hired, $2 million. That was more revenue than I'd ever brought in at Ashford and Associates as a percentage of my time, and I was keeping most of it. I wasn't sitting around gloating about what was happening at Ashford. I wasn't taking satisfaction in their struggles or their failure. Honestly, I was too busy building something real. I was working longer hours than I ever had before, but it was different work. It was mine. Every success was mine. Every client relationship was mine. Every win belonged to me and the team I was creating around me. I wasn't just making someone else's company successful. I was making my own company successful. Then came the phone call I'd been both dreading and kind of expecting. It was Marcus. About 4 months after my firing, he called my cell phone. I don't know how he got the number, probably from the company directory, and his voice was different. Gone was the confident CEO tone. What I heard instead was someone who was panicking, someone who was desperate. "James, hey, how are you? I was just thinking about you, and I realized that maybe we made a mistake with how we handled your situation. I've been looking at our account management division, and there's been some challenges. Things have shifted. We've lost some clients. We'd love to talk about you coming back. What would it take? Name your price. Tell me what you want." I remember taking a breath before I responded. My first instinct was to be angry, to tell him exactly what I thought about how he'd handled things, to remind him of how little respect he'd shown me, to make him feel as small as he'd made me feel in his office, to say, "You had your chance, and you threw it away." But that wouldn't have been productive, and I knew it. More importantly, I realized something in that moment. I didn't actually want to go back. Not for any price, not with any promises, because the trust was broken. Once you've been fired like that, once you've felt that disrespect, you can't unfeel it. Instead, I kept my voice calm and professional. I said, "Marcus, I appreciate you reaching out, but I'm actually in a really good place right now with my own firm. I've got clients, things are growing, and honestly, I don't think coming back would be the right move for me, for either of us." He pushed. He tried different angles. He told me about the new role I could have, the compensation increase, the corner office, the title he'd give me, the promises that things would be different. He said he'd made a mistake. He said he'd been wrong to let me go. He said he'd learned from it. And the whole time, I just kept thinking about that moment in his office, when he didn't even let me sit down, when he'd decided my fate without actually caring about my perspective. I told him, as calmly as I could, "Marcus, I appreciate the offer. I really do. But it's not going to work. I've moved on. And I think it's better for everyone if we leave it at that." He kept pushing, his desperation becoming more apparent with every sentence. "Come on, James. We can work this out. I made a mistake. I admit it. Please, just come back." I told him, as calmly as I could, "It's not going to work, Marcus, but I wish you the best with figuring out the transition." Then I hung up, and I didn't answer when he called back, or when he called back again, or when he called back a third time. I found out later that he'd lost 3 more clients after that call, and then 2 more, and then another one. Kellerman switched over entirely to using Brennan Consulting for their strategic work. Sterling Financial followed. Hartwell Manufacturing did the same. By the end of 6 months, almost every significant client I'd had at Ashford had either moved to Brennan Consulting or was in the process of transitioning. He called back a few more times over the next couple of months, each time more desperate, each time offering more money, more benefits, more promises that things would be different. He was panicking. I could hear it in his voice. One of those calls, he actually started crying. He said, "James, I've made a huge mistake. The company is falling apart. I don't know what happened. Please, just come back and help me fix this." And you know what I felt in that moment? Absolutely nothing. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just nothing. Because I realized that his problems weren't my problems anymore. I'd moved on. I had clients who wanted to work with me. I had a business to build, and his crisis was his own. Each time he called, my response was the same. "It's not my problem anymore, Marcus." And I meant it. I wasn't saying it to hurt him or to make a point. I was saying it because it was true. His mistakes, his bad decisions, his inability to understand how to run a business that was built on relationships and trust, those weren't my responsibility to fix anymore. And that became my mantra, honestly. Not in a bitter way, just in a factual way. The problems at Ashford and Associates, those weren't mine to solve anymore. My responsibility was to my new clients, to my new firm, to the people I'd chosen to work with. What I didn't realize at the time was how badly the damage was cascading inside Ashford. When you lose that much client revenue, we're talking about multiple millions of dollars, it's not just a number on a spreadsheet. It's not an abstract concept. It means real, concrete things. It means you have to lay off staff. Consultants who had nothing to do with my situation got fired because the company couldn't afford to pay them. It means you have to close offices. The Boston office, which had 30 people, got downsized to 5. It means you can't make payroll. The company that Robert Ashford had spent his entire career building was now in real trouble, and it had happened so fast that Marcus hadn't even understood what was happening until it was already too late to recover. This is the thing about business that people don't always understand. When you build a company on relationships, and those relationships walk out the door, the company doesn't gradually decline. It collapses. There's no slow decline where you have time to recover. It's a sudden shock to the system. One moment you think things are fine. The next moment, your biggest revenue generators are gone, and you're in a fight for survival. I'd see news about the company occasionally. There was an article in a business publication about Ashford having to restructure. Then another one about them losing major contracts and talent. Then another one about financial difficulties and needing to cut costs. These articles made it clear that the company was in serious trouble, and I realized that this was all a direct consequence of the decision Marcus made that day in his office. I didn't take satisfaction in it, but I also didn't feel bad about it. That was the consequence of his decision. He'd made a choice when he fired me, thinking it would help him or the company. He'd made that choice from a position of arrogance, thinking he knew better than Robert about how to run a business. And that choice had consequences, real, measurable, painful consequences. Not just for Marcus, but for everyone who worked there. He didn't foresee that the value of his company was directly tied to my relationships with clients, but it was. What I did feel good about was what I'd built. Brennan Consulting grew steadily. I hired consultants who believed in the same values I did: deep client relationships, genuine problem solving, integrity, and genuine care for client success. When I hired people, I looked for people who actually gave a damn. People who would stay late if a client needed them. People who would think about a client's problem on weekends because they cared about solving it. People who understood that our job wasn't to bill hours. Our job was to make our clients successful. We weren't the biggest firm in the city. We didn't have fancy offices or hundreds of employees, but we were profitable. We were respected. We had a reputation for delivering results and actually caring about our clients. And every single day I got to work with clients who actually wanted to work with me. Not with me because they were contractually obligated to work with my company. They chose to work with me. They could have worked with bigger firms. They could have worked with other consultants. But they chose Brennan because they trusted me and my team. That's worth more than any fancy office or big budget. I think the lesson in this for me wasn't about revenge or vindication or any of that. It was understanding a much simpler truth. You can't build a successful company by treating people like they're disposable, especially when those people are the actual foundation of your business model. Robert Ashford understood that on a deep level. He'd built his entire company on the principle of respecting and empowering the people who made the business work. That was his competitive advantage. That was why clients trusted Ashford and Associates, because they knew that Robert valued his people. Marcus never understood it. He thought the company was his because his name was on the sign and his father had given him the job. He thought being the owner meant he could make unilateral decisions without worrying about consequences. He thought he could treat people like chess pieces to be moved around according to his vision. But that's not how business works. A company isn't buildings or desks or office space. It's not a title or a corner office. It's people. It's relationships. It's the trust that clients and employees place in you. And when you break that trust, when you fire someone just because they weren't part of your inner circle, you don't just lose an employee. You lose the whole ecosystem they've built. You lose all the relationships they've cultivated. You lose all the goodwill they've generated. And you lose the trust of everyone else who sees how you treat people. The funny thing is, I ran into Robert about 2 years after all of this happened. We were at some business conference, and we grabbed coffee. He asked me what happened at the firm, what really happened from my perspective. I could have told him that Marcus was an arrogant kid who didn't know what he was doing. I could have blamed Marcus for destroying the company he'd spent decades building. I could have taken satisfaction in explaining how it had all fallen apart. But I didn't do that. I told him the truth, but I did it without trying to make Marcus look bad. I just explained that I'd been let go, that my clients followed me, and that I'd started my own thing. I told him the company had great bones but was having some challenges. I told him I was doing well, that my business was growing, and that I was happy. And you know what he said? I always knew Marcus wasn't quite ready to run that company, but I needed to let him learn the hard way. Sometimes the best leadership lessons come from your worst mistakes. He looked sad when he said it. Not bitter, not angry, just sad. Like he felt the weight of that decision, to hand off his company to his son and watch it struggle because of his own inexperience and poor judgment. He told me that he'd always imagined Marcus would run the company successfully, that he'd watch his son grow into the role, that the company would continue to thrive under new leadership. But that's not what happened. What happened was what happens when you promote someone based on nepotism instead of competence, when you hand them authority without giving them the wisdom to use it properly. I felt something in that moment. Not satisfaction at seeing Marcus fail, but a kind of sadness for Robert. He'd built something beautiful, and his son had mismanaged it and destroyed it, and Robert had to watch that happen. I didn't gloat about it. In fact, I felt a little bit bad for Marcus in that moment, because he'd been given this incredible opportunity, this inheritance that most people would dream of, and he'd thrown it away because he couldn't see beyond his own ego and his desire to prove something. He couldn't see that the actual value of the company wasn't in his position or his title. It was in the people. Marcus had everything he needed to succeed. He had a profitable, established company. He had a great reputation in the market. He had experienced employees who knew how to do the job. All he had to do was not screw it up. All he had to do was respect the people who'd built the company and maintain the relationships that made it successful. Instead, he tried to remake it in his own image, and in doing so, he destroyed it. That's the tragedy of nepotism. It's not always that the heir is incapable. Sometimes it's that they have so much to prove, so much need to establish themselves as their own person, that they destroy what was built before them in the process. Marcus's insecurity and his need to prove that he was worthy of the role, that he wasn't just some kid who got lucky, was what killed the company. Looking back, getting fired ended up being one of the best things that ever happened to me. Not because I wanted revenge or vindication, or to see Marcus suffer, but because it forced me to stop being comfortable. It forced me to realize that my value wasn't dependent on my job title or the name of the company on my business card. My value was in the relationships I'd built, the trust I'd earned, and the genuine care I had for doing good work. Those things are mine. They're not tied to any company. They're tied to me. Getting fired was like waking up from a long sleep. I'd been working for someone else's dream, building someone else's legacy, making someone else rich, and I'd been good at it, but I'd never been building something that was truly mine. Once I was forced out, I realized that I could do all those things, build relationships, solve problems, help companies grow, for myself. I could keep the fruits of my labor. I could build something that would belong to me. When Marcus begged me to come back, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt nothing, really, because he wasn't actually apologizing. He wasn't actually asking me to come back because he valued me as a person or an employee. He was asking because I represented money and clients and revenue. I was a solution to his problem, not a person he respected or cared about. And that's not a relationship. That's a transaction. That's desperation masquerading as a peace offering. The truth is, every choice you make in business, especially as a leader, has consequences. Sometimes those consequences come quick. Sometimes they take time, but they always come. That's just how the world works. Marcus chose to fire me without cause. He made that choice thinking it would help him. He made that choice from a position of ego, thinking he needed to bring in his people to prove himself. His consequence was losing the clients I'd brought with me, and by the time he realized what had actually happened, it was too late to undo it. The damage was done. I don't think about him much anymore. I'm too busy focused on the business I've built, the clients I serve, and the team I work with every single day. That's where my energy goes now. Not to the past, not to vindication, not to thinking about Marcus or Ashford and Associates, just to building something real and lasting, just to making my clients successful, which makes my business successful, which makes my life better. And that's the honest truth of what happened when my boss's son fired me and then begged when my clients left with me. It wasn't some dramatic revenge story. It was just the natural consequence of forgetting that business isn't about power or hierarchy or legacy. It's about the people who choose to show up and work with you. And when you lose those people, you lose everything. That's the only real lesson here. That's the only thing that actually matters.